Howdy folks, I assume if you're here you've already heard of Tumbleseed. If it's new to you and you want to know a little bit more about the game in general, here's a link to an overview video I did. For those of you who are still with me, I played a lot of this game immediately after release. Partly in hopes of getting that miracle run and winning the contest the fine folks at aeiowu were running, and partly because I just wanted to figure out whether I hated the game or not. After some trials and tribulation, I decided that yeah, I like it mostly. It took a lot of acclimation though, and I hope these tips help you out whether you're struggling like I was or simply looking for ways to improve your game. Without further ado, tip number 0. The game is all about control. That might seem patently obvious, but I don't mean that somewhat awkward twin sticks control of balancing. That's monumentally important, but the only thing I can tell you about that is practice till you get good. What I really mean by control is the ability to remain calm and plan. Even when the screen is starting to get overwhelming, snakes are chasing you, avalanche is coming down, all that kind of stuff. And that's because the progression of the game is all about rising action. Each zone tries harder and harder to overwhelm you, and does so very quickly. Regardless, it's always important to remain cool and collected. Maneuvering quickly and use of seed powers are very important skills to learn, but the controls will always be just unintuitive enough that focus is paramount to success. Anyway, even though I just told you all I could tell you was get good, here are a few tips about movement anyway. There's a level on the bar that indicates whether Tumbleseed will roll left or right. Once you're balanced, moving up and down is always easier than tilting left or right. I always find it helpful to line the balance bar itself up with the edge of a hole while maneuvering, since I know that means I won't fall into it. Always tilt only as much as you need to. That extreme tilting gives you a lot of momentum and makes it difficult to control, and the game is all about controlling your momentum. As a rule of thumb, Tumbleseed's eyeballs the hitbox for holes. That said, if there's a visible space between a wall and a hole, it's almost always safe to just hug the wall and gun it. Tip number 1. Remember to plant flags. That seems almost insultingly obvious being told to in a video like this, but in the moment, it's very easy to forget or prioritize, oh, I need to activate a shield, or I need to drop a fly trap, or bomb, or whatever. In fact, I almost titled this tip, Don't Fall in Holes, but that's really the obvious problem that this tip is a solution for. Falling loses you 1 or more hearts, and you have to backtrack through the still dangerous area you've already depleted of resources. If you have a choice between taking a hit and falling in a hole, take the hit almost every time. Flags are an important insurance policy that minimizes the disaster that is falling into a hole. If you're still learning the controls, plant flags early and plant them often. Time spent backtracking or resetting is time not spent learning all the other intricacies of the controls. Once you're more established, you should be able to complete the forest without needing to plant flags, but in every other zone, absolutely plant flags anytime you clear a particularly nasty part of the level. You never know when a worm or turret will force your hand and cause you to make a misstep into a hole, pretty much ending the run. Tip number 2. Try to have around 20 crystals by the end of the forest. This tip is a consequence of the way managing resources in the game works. I go in depth on this in my other video, but for the most part you only have control over 2 things. Where Tumbleseed is and what happens when he rolls over a plot. This means you always need to weigh the risk of losing a heart versus making sure you have enough resources. Plots are always an opportunity cost. Think of them as 2/3 of a crystal. This means your seed powers can be roughly considered to cost an additional 2/3 times the number of plots required to activate them, thus a heart costs you 6 2/3 crystals, plus the risks involved in activating the plots. When you've got the controls down pretty well, the forest has almost no risk and is a perfect time to build up your crystal supply. I usually stay as the crystal until I've built up about 20 crystals and then spend the rest of the level acquiring hearts. I say 20 because that will let you buy just about any seed power if you need it, and leave you with plenty free to activate offensive seed powers and the heart power during the jungle. Speaking of, during the jungle, most of your crystals will come as the spoils of battle, which leads me to the next tip. Tip number 3. Engage enemies only when necessary. Just like in real life, you should only ever kill things in self-defense, or when you stand to gain something and can get away with it. Please do not take this as legal advice, I am not a lawyer. Enemies fall into a few broad categories. Mobile obstacles, which you simply need to avoid. Dangerous enemies, which you must develop a plan for dealing with, which usually involves using a plot for an offensive seed power. And mobile obstacles that actually give you a return on investment. Remember how plots cost 2/3 of a crystal? That means activating a thorn, your basic offensive ability, actually costs 1 2/3 crystals. Most of these guys only give you 1 crystal with a chance for 2. On average, you're spending resources to off grubs, which is not good at all. These charging bugs and these dragonflies each give you 4 or 5 crystals, meaning you come out at least 2/3 of a crystal ahead, at minimum. If they're isolated, They're pretty easy to kill, but remember not to take risks. Too many of the leech guys in one area with holes is likely to get you to take damage, and then you're functionally down at least 6 2/3 crystals worth of heart. Tip number 4. Be ready to use an offensive seed power in jungle and a defensive seed power in desert, or have a plan to kill every worm you meet. Spiders and worms are typically the most dangerous individual enemies you can encounter. They will track you to the ends of the earth, putting pressure on you when you need it the least. Their lesser kin, the hexfly, is also worth stabbing with a thorn, even if it usually leaves you a fraction of a crystal down. I usually prefer to build up my hearts during the jungle, and I earn the crystal to do so by killing worms and hopefully spiders. Spiders are easier to dodge. They have a set jump distance that will go over you if you're too close. Worms are a bit easier to hit, and they bump off of objects, allowing you to use the environment as cover. There are 5 seed powers available every time before you get to jungle, so you should always have something usable. Fly traps, long shot, squash, boomerang. You have to work with what you can get, so each run you should try to practice with whatever you do get. The desert is more of an obstacle course, or bullet hell. Having shield sprout by the time you get here is absolutely critical because that will save you from taking many hearts of damage. Reflect root will do in a pinch, even though it only lasts for 1 shot. Advance carefully, focus on building up hearts, and only attack targets if you absolutely have to. It's a very different challenge in the jungle with more holes, but nothing will be actively chasing you down. Just watch for the bullets coming from below. Tip number 5. Everything has friendly fire. Everything you use can and will be used against you. You'll be lased by ray flower, hit by missile root. The auras always have a distinct drawback because they apply to enemies as well. That's just keep it in mind. That's all I have to say. And the correlated tip 0, tip number 6, keep calm and carry on. I can't really tell you much about the snowfields or the peak. The snow is kind of a nightmare hell run through holes that combines several of the enemies and obstacles from the previous areas. Hopefully you'll have a stockpile of crystals, hearts, and useful seed powers. Blood fruit. If not, all you've got is all you ever really had, the ability to keep your wits about you and make a break for the peak. And I've never been to the peak. I won't spoil it for you, even though I've spoiled it for myself. Just be ready. It is short, though. And there you have it, folks. A few humble tips on how to suck less at Tumbleseed. I can't claim to help you succeed, as I have yet to reach the peak myself, like I just said, and I'm sure there are folks out there better than me, but even if you aren't, please feel free to leave a comment if you've got some insight, if you have a tip for something I didn't cover, or if you have a question. I may incorporate it into a second video once I'm confident enough that I can routinely make successful runs and thus have any business giving this kind of advice. Thank you for watching. I'm Owen Quillian, signing off.